Mark Dion here. This is the first time I'm doing a lecture with no audience, so you'll have to bear with me. I really have to just jump in because I think we really need to cover a lot of material. So I'm going to start. You're in the city of Venice, right? Venice is this incredible city of the history of art, of the accumulation of wealth, of early colonial endeavor. And I wanted to make a project in which the viewer walks through the entirety of a Renaissance artist production studio. And you would start there in the studiolo. So we often think about the idea of artist research as something new, right? As though we just discovered the idea that artist research, and nothing could be further from the case. In the Renaissance, there was even a space within the workshop called the studiolo that was designated as a space for artist research, where the artists would have their few books, where they would meet their clients, their patrons, and they would think and work through initial ideas. If we visit this studiolo, we see that the artist is focusing on looking at pre-Enlightenment collections, Renaissance collections, so-called Wunderkammer or cabinets of curiosity. You know, these collections are shockingly numerous in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. They are, they are not really one thing. If you think about how many there are, they have drastically different goals. They're produced by very different kinds of people. They are undoubtedly part of the beginnings of these colonial endeavors, but they are far from what we would recognize as the museum. So a lot of people like to imagine that this is the infancy of the museum itself, but we're really 200 years from what we would recognize as a museum today. They mix a variety of materials, natural and artificial. Often the artificial and the natural are joined together to make a single thing. They are places of incredible discourse, right? They're places that people come, and you see in this image there's one person pointing, there's another person with a pointer. They are places where people talk through what these objects are. Each image is also filled with books as well. I like to imagine what these places smelled like, to be honest. So what is the Cabinet of Wonder? You know, it's not a museum in a way that we would know. It's not a university in a way that we would know, although it is somehow a university of things. It is somehow a cosmological gathering, in miniature of the world. It's a sort of microcosm. And it's a place where its owner, the person who assembles it, exhibits their power, their global reach, their erudition. It is a very, very discursive space. So in my project, you enter through the studiolo and you come next to the first room of the workshop. And here, if you come on a good day, you will find my team and I busily producing things. So what we're doing is we're looking through these 17th century catalogs of the Cabinet of Wonder, and we are reproducing the objects within those images. So what interests me about this is that we're going through, we're in some way, we're talking about a chain that began 400 years ago with a real organism, say a sea snail or something like that, who lives in an ecosystem in a place maybe like the Philippines, where this snail unfortunately encounters a Dutch sailor who is undoubtedly part of some horrific colonial endeavor. That sailor collects the snail, kills it, boils it out of its shell. He takes the shell, puts that into his sea duffel bag, eventually gets back to Haarlem or Amsterdam, where at the end of the dock there is a curiosity curiosity collection shop, and he sells that to the owner, who then sells it on to a collector, who places that object in his cosmological cabinet, where later it's drawn by an artist, made into an engraving by an engraver, bound into a book, and that's the end of the story for 400 years. So I'm interested in building another link on that chain, right? So my team and I Christy Gast, Pandora Gastelum, Clara Hobsa, Dana Sherwood, and I are all busy reproducing these objects from the images I just showed you, the engravings and woodcuts. This is the second room in which we're doing some of the finishing work on the things that we're producing. And then lastly, they go to, this would be the equivalent in the Renaissance studio perhaps of the varnishing room, right? Where things are acquiring their final finish. And here is my assistant, Sarah Mercer, who is applying our special paint to a basilisk. And then visitors enter our Cabinet of Wonder, right? So the Cabinet of Wonder is a darkened room in which all of the things that we produce, which have been covered with highly phosphorescent paint, glow, right? And when you come in as a visitor, you notice, of course, that the cabinets themselves are not full because the process that I just showed you, from the studiolo to the workshop, to the finishing room, to the varnishing room, that isn't before the exhibition, that is the exhibition. So when you come through, all of that process is foregrounded and you see how things are made. And when you enter this space, you see that things are not yet complete, right? So that for me, I'm always interested in foregrounding the idea of process in my work. So that's very much an aspect of what I do. You know, as an artist, I've never seen a painting that was more interesting in the museum than it was in the artist studio, where you see the potentiality, you see the roads not taken, you see the struggle to produce meaning. And so I want, in some way, even if it's a very highly theatrical way, to have that process in the foreground, and that process including research. You know, and here you have the kind of typologies that you have within those collections. You know, you have natural and artificial wonders. You have things that people would be reasonably familiar with, and you have things that are in the category of the marvelous. And certainly this is, of course, called the Age of the Marvelous. And these objects for the collectors in the Renaissance, of course, had extremely strong, not just allegorical meaning, but also actual practical meaning. You know, as much as people like to say, these cabinets are the birthplace of the museum and the birthplace of science, it's also very easy to say that these are very much embedded in the world of magic and the Hermetic tradition as well. So that's one of the things that makes the Cabinet of Wonder interesting, is that it does not demonstrate the triumph of science like Enlightenment museums do. Rather, magic is very much alive within these objects, and so, which of course is something to me kind of quite exciting as a sculptor, you know, to who's working with objects that have expanded meanings. And you see also a lot of the objects that are represented are things that we might be familiar with. There's you know, this bird in the center, of course, is the great auk, which is one of the birds that's represented in the cabinet of Ole Worm from Denmark. But it also is important because it's an extinct bird, and it was driven to extinction finally through scientific collection. So scientists realized that these birds were disappearing, and set out to collect the last specimens and the last eggs. You know, other objects represent other cultures. You have to imagine that, you know, this is collecting archaeological objects before there is a category of archaeology. Fossils are being collected before people understand what fossils are. This is the famous Fiji mermaid. One of the things that traditional people learned is that Europeans were voracious for collecting curiosities and oddities, and soon they began a market to produce things produce fakes and forgeries and humbugs for that market. So this is the cabinet, one of the cabinets as it exists in the end. And again, everything is painted with this phosphorescence, so they become like ghosts. I'm not really a believer in ghost inspectors, but the way that specters function in the literary tradition is extremely interesting to me, and I think very relevant to how museum objects function. Very often they are present because there is something rotten in the state of Denmark. There is something, a crime or something unfinished business, something undone. There is a sort of evil deed that has gone unpunished, or a mystery that is unresolved. And that's very much how I think these objects are intended to function, and that's very much how I think museum objects function in general. I work a lot with this notion of the cabinet of wonder, sometimes making cabinets of wonder, sometimes arranging them. This is a place called the Gathering Place. It is a park that was produced some years ago in Tulsa by the philanthropist George Kaiser for the people of Tulsa. He is from Tulsa, and this is a structure in the park called the Boathouse. They produced in the design of the Boathouse, they always had a room that they called the Cabinet of Wonder, and they commissioned me to produce a Cabinet of Wonder, and this is the result of that. So this is a public space that people can go into, and it in some way stretches back through time, looking at the tradition of the Cabinet of Wonder. It also speaks very directly to the complex and violent history of Tulsa, which I think a lot of people maybe know about more this week than they have in the past. And it talks to the history of collecting, the reasons why one collects, the different typographies in collecting in the process. It talks a lot through different mediums about different topics. So there are photographic collections, there are collections of maps which show the evolution of Oklahoma from Indian territory to the state that it is now, one of the strangest states in the nation. And again, this is filled with literally thousands of objects, which the viewer is encouraged to engage in through intellectual inquiry. I play a lot with some of the categories that one might have found within collections, like early collections. So, for instance, the allegories of the elements, earth, air, fire, water, and ether, are represented within the collection. The seasons. Every Cabinet of Wonder, of course, requires a crocodile. This is the crocodile in the Tulsa Cabinet of Wonder, perched very closely to a payphone of one of the famous steakhouses that many people from Tulsa would have visited during its time. So for a project like this, I'm really trying to build something that talks about the history of collecting, the history of museums, the types of organizations where one encounters things, whether that's libraries, the questions of access, what one can touch, one cannot, surprising juxtapositions. You see also, as I said, historic arrangements, whether those are allegories like the seasons or the elements, or notions like the great chain of being, are all kind of placed into this project in a way to, I think, hopefully give a sort of critical understanding of them, but also to, in some way, produce joy around the incredible materiality that's represented in this collection. There are about 36 drawers which can also be opened, and the drawers represent, a lot of them represent local history. There's a very large collection of vernacular photography, Tulsa souvenirs. So the piece oscillates from the global to the extremely local. There are maps, for instance, of the exact site of a gathering place, showing that it was once the property of Native Americans. And there are these very surprising juxtapositions, which I really delight in, like this. Yeah, this is my son grabbing a book. There are hundreds of books which can actually be handled. Occasionally, of course, books are stolen. It's not the worst thing in the world when someone steals a book, and I have a very large reservoir of books in which things can be replaced. One of the other features in building this extraordinary structure with the architects Mack and Merrill, there's a lot of, because they were really excited about having a space that undulates. So there's wasted space behind the walls, and I'm not really a person who likes to waste space in an exhibition. So behind the wall, I also built a sort of a little bit of a folly. It promises, the door says it's the office of the custodian of collections. And if you peek through the windows, you see a workshop, but it's all been built in forced perspective. So, so the table, for instance, is much larger as it gets closer to the viewer. So it gives the illusion that this is an actual functional space or a much larger space when it's built in a sort of illusionistic and installed in an illusionistic manner, a little bit like a Bernini folly. So I want to take you from Tulsa to the remote Arlen Mountain in Norway. The Arlen Mountain is never warm. So this is the Arlen Mountain in August, probably one of the warmest days that we see. It's well above the tree line. You still have snow. So, you know, Norway is an exceptionally interesting country in so many ways, but one way is that because of its tremendous wealth through its oil reserves and through harvesting oil in the North Sea, which has been doing decade after decade, the nation itself has become wealthy. So instead of this petroleum going to shareholders or families who own oil companies, it's nationalized. So with that vast wealth, the Norwegian government has invested in its future, has built infrastructure, has built opera houses, schools, libraries, universities, ports and airports, and including one of the big projects was to construct the road from Bergen to Oslo, which had to go over mountain passes like the Arlen Mountains, which no matter how developed the technology is, it's hard to keep those mountain passes open over the course of the winter. So they built tunnels. So these tunnels are enormous. The one that goes under the Arlen Mountains is 23 kilometers long, right? So it's just fantastic. So then the question became, what do we do with these old roads, right? How do we, these old roads, we may need them at some point, but they also go through some of the most stunning landscapes available anywhere. They pass glacial ponds, and they pass miles and miles of tundra and mountain peaks, and they overlook fjords. And so they said, well, let's turn this into the National Tourist Road. And so people from all over the world can come and see this amazing landscape. And then they said, well, that's great, but that's not enough. Let's also hire some of the world's leading forward-thinking architects to come and build all the structures for this area. So scenic overlooks, rest stops, hotels, all sorts of things. That was amazingly successful. And for 10 years, they built award-winning architectural structures. Then after a decade, they said, okay, now let's put in the public art. And that's where I came in. I was brought to this spot, and they said, we'd like you to make public artwork here. And I thought, what could be worse than fucking up a beautiful landscape like this with a work of art? So I had to think a lot about it. I had to do a lot of research into Norway and its history, its archaeology and natural history. And this is an area where, you know, it seems like there, you know, that this is an incredibly intact natural site. And it is, except that there are two things missing, right? There are the bears and the wolves. You know, uh, the apex predators that directly compete with humans, and we are seem to be incapable of tolerating their presence, even in a pristine landscape like this. So I wanted to make something that related to that. I wanted to make something that related to uh, in Norwegian mythology, like in many mythologies, there's a great deal of traffic between the underworld and our world, and heroes visit the underworld in Norwegian myths very much like they do in classical mythology. And so I wanted to build an entrance to the underworld. It's about my height, which is not very tall. So most Norwegian men are much taller than I am. And you have to pass through this corridor, which is about 30 feet long, and then you find yourself in a very large chamber, a room. And in that chamber, one finds that you're facing a diorama, and that diorama depicts the inside of a cave with stalactites and stalagmites and rock walls. And in the midst of that cave is a giant pile of human material, starting at the very bottom with Paleolithic, Neolithic objects. We have the beginnings of sort of Viking culture, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. We have the development of settled agriculture, the influence on the classical world, on the rest of Europe, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, right up through the wars, and the invention of plastic. So the higher up you go, of course, the more contemporary the objects become, and perhaps not inconspicuous, on top of this all is a giant sleeping bear, right? And for me, that bear represents this sort of notion of wilderness, of wild places. You know, where bears are, usually people aren't, right? And so, and very much as the case with natural systems, this bear is in some way sleeping off this phenomena we might call civilization or the Anthropocene, waiting for the opportunity to reemerge and take possession of this landscape. So I want to bring you back to Venice and talk about one of the first archaeological projects that I produced. Not the first, but you know, Venice is this great city of history, romance, architecture, literature, and it's also a city of incredibly disgusting mud. And that mud is at the bottom of the canals. It's also a place where it's very hard to get rid of objects because everything must come by boat, by barge. So if you buy a giant big screen TV to watch Super Bowl, that pretty much has to come to you by boat in some way. And if your washing machine breaks down, it also has to leave by boat, unless, of course, in the middle of the night, it should get close to the edge of the canal, and there's a gentle plop, and you've saved yourself a lot of money. So objects like this build up in the bottom of the canals, and the city has a navy of these barges that dredge the canal, putting their scooper arm into the bottom of the canal, pulling up mud and debris, placing it in the center of the barge, and then they sail out to the lagoon and they dump it. And they do this over and over and over again. And so I was invited to be the guest of the Nordic Pavilion for the Venice Biennale, because I clearly am the Nordic ideal. And I thought, well, I want to relocate the contents of one of these barges to our beautiful pavilion. And then over the course of the Biennale, I want to go through and find out what is inside of this. So I want to clean this sample. Now, this stuff is everything people say it is. It's extremely polluted. It's full of household waste. It's full of industrial waste from 500 years of industry here. It's anaerobic. It has a very strange ecology of organisms that need very little oxygen. It smells like rotten eggs, but it is also so incredibly archaeologically rich. You know, if you stick a pencil into this mud, you will hit something. And so my job over the course of the summer was to find out what that something was, not only to find it, but also to arrange it. And so I took over their storeroom and created something that was something in between, say, a cabinet of wonder and a treasure trove, right? So the medieval tradition is the treasure trove. You take your treasure and you hide it, right? You put it in the deepest dungeon or the highest tower, out of sight. The Renaissance is sort of the age of bling, right? You take your treasure and you display it. You show it because it also reflects power onto you. It shows you your global reach, your access to skilled laborers, artists. It shows you your scholarship, right? So in this space, I don't have treasure chests. I don't have treasures. I don't have emeralds. I have broken green bottles. I don't have pearls. I have broken up shells. I don't have gold and silver. I have oxidized bits of metal. I don't have a crocodile to hang from the ceiling. And when I'm working on these projects, I'm trying not to recapitulate what, say, an archaeological museum would do. They do that, and they do it reasonably well sometimes. So I'm not trying to tell you about the evolution of techniques and technologies. I'm not trying to show you how the design of one region influences another, how there are technological innovations that change disciplines. I'm trying to put things together in a way that is in some way almost childlike, as though I am that proverbial Martian archaeologist who comes to our planet without really understanding what these objects are and what they're for, right? So that to me is a really exciting way of putting these things together based on other kinds of associations, based on form, based on color, based on really simple ideas that also create a kind of extraordinarily marvelous way of display that does not in any way copy or imitate the methodologies that things are placed in museums today. And at the same time, I can't help but mess with your expectations of what a museum is and what it does. That's a big part of my interest in some way. So you'll see a collection like this. It's a collection of ceramics that were pulled out of the canal. And you see there's several hundred years of ceramics represented here. Everyone is carefully numbered, but if you try to find the reference for that number, you'll go mad. So so I am taking that expectation that you're going to learn something very specific through this display and subverting it by not allowing that to happen, by forcing you to have other kinds of associations, right? To in some way to frustrate your expectations of what an exhibit and what a museum is. And the last section, so the first section is the sort of dig itself. The middle section in this case is the display, and the last section is actually the process. So you enter the final room, and you see objects that are still embedded in mud. You see things that are beginning to be classified, but are not yet, maybe have a different system of classification that then ends up in the actual exhibition rooms. You see things, again, you see the process, you see the tools of the process. Once again, I'm just really interested in showing the process and in not so much in demystifying the process, but making it very clear what is happening, and also showing you that there's nothing natural about the way things finally end up getting represented. It's the result of a number of choices, and it's a result of connoisseurship, and it's a result of composition. And so it's not chance operation, nor is it entirely scholarship. Of course, I found tremendous numbers of things while cleaning this sample, and this was by far the worst summer of my entire life, right? So, Venice is extremely hot. The Venice Biennale is crowded, absolutely packed. This material I'm working with is very dense. It's very oily. It's full of chemicals. I had to get hepatitis shots and I had to get tetanus shots. And so I thought, well, that's the end of this process. I'm not going to be doing any more archaeological projects. I'm going to retire from archaeology. So for my next archaeology project, I worked in the city of London, and I worked on the River Thames. You know, London is a much older city than Venice. Venice isn't old by Italian standards at all. There's no, there's no Etruscan or Roman Venice, but London goes way, way back. And the reason for London to be where it is, of course, is the River Thames. The River Thames is an incredibly strong, active river. It's a tidal river. So twice a day, the tide goes in and out. And this area where you see people standing and sitting is called the foreshore. The foreshore is visible in central London, usually for around 4 hours a day, twice a day. And so I wanted to do 2 archaeological excavations in front of the 2 Tates. So this was in 1999, so there was an interesting new situation in which suddenly there were 2 Tates. Tate Britain, what used to be called Tate Gallery, and Tate Modern. These are linked by the Thames, but in places that have just very drastically different social histories, right? So I worked with people from Bankside, from where the Tate was setting off their new flagship, and each day we would go down on the foreshore. One of the things about the foreshore is it is impossibly archaeologically rich. I mean, it's sort of embarrassingly archaeologically rich. Any spot you look down, you will see fragments of the material culture of the last 600 or 700 years, and it's all there. But it is not there in a way that archaeologists would find very useful, because the context has been destroyed. So archaeologists aren't really that excited about things per se. They're interested in things in relationship to other things. They're very interested in the context. They're interested in what the stratification of things tells them. They're not really treasure hunters, right? So, when I work on archaeological sites, or when I work on archaeology, I try to always use places that archaeologists have deemed insignificant and disturbed, which might be a good title for the whole practice anyway. And so these are sites where things have become jumbled, and every time the tide changes, it's a new roll of the dice as to what one might find. So I did 2 digs, 1 week at each site, 1 week at Bankside, 1 week at Millbank, about 4.5 hours on each dig, working with my team of volunteers. The volunteers were either under 17 or over 65, so teenagers and pensioners. And we would identify an area, and I would instruct them to collect every human-made thing from that area. And of course, sometimes it's really quite hard to tell if something is a human-made thing or not. And those things became, some of my favorite finds, when a teenager can't tell if a flint is a piece of machinery or if it's stone. That for me is a really exciting moment, because it really does harken back to that interplay of the artificial and the natural that we talked about in relationship to the Cabinet of Wonder. It's funny, you can see in this image my team of the people with the colorful vests on, and then there's another group of people by the water. That's actually a coven of witches, because this was the summer solstice, and these are witches who are doing a witchy baptism at noon on the summer solstice. Anyway, so I worked with brilliant people. I mean, some of you who are there in Chicago might recognize Naomi Beckwith, who worked with me on this project as one of my project managers. And next to her is Lenka Clayton, who is an exceptionally good artist who now lives in Pittsburgh. I worked with both of them when they were much younger as well. This was like the second project I worked on with both of these 2 absolutely brilliant people. This is Hamsini and Alexis, who are 2 of the girls from the school who I worked with, and they have this uncanny ability to find things. Some people have a highly developed search image, and this kind of idea in the back of your head that helps you find things. And they were finding needles and pins from the old needle, pin, wire, and nail trade. The London Bridge that tumbles into the Thames is the center of the needle, pin, wire, nail trade. So this is my group on any one day. So we do 1 week at Bankside, 1 week at Millbank, this many people collecting for 4 hours. That means we're collecting tens of thousands of things. All of those things, every tiny glass shard, every bottle cap, every bit of ceramic, it all comes to the lawn of the Tate. The lawn of the Tate in the summer is incredibly busy. It's very much like the steps of the Art Institute or the steps of the Metropolitan in New York. It's overwhelmed with people. So, so we put up this tape to protect our, we have these sort of Indiana Jones style tents. We're sort of colonizing the colonizer in a way, taking over this space at the Tate. And behind the tape, our team are processing all of the stuff that we found. So every little thing comes out of its container, gets cleaned and cataloged. People tended to, treat us a little bit like the Antiques Roadshow. They wanted to know what was the oldest thing we found, what was the most valuable thing we found. The idea was that the tape would separate some casual visitors, but unless you were an obvious lunatic, you were allowed to come past the tape and mingle and look into our tents and talk to our team. I love this wonderful dandy who's coming to take a stroll to look at our finds. So 1 tent for Bankside, 1 tent for Millbank. Everything comes out, everything is cleaned. During this period also, we do every day a lunchtime lecture. So we lecture on, we have social historians, we have art historians, we have archaeologists, we have people who have a practical relationship with the river, like the Thames Police Force or the harbor master. Every day someone comes and spends an hour and a half with us talking about the Thames, talking about its history, helping us to conceptualize and understand what these objects are, what we found. People from the Museum of London were incredibly helpful. But this is a lot of work. I mean, we really have to, we have to clean thousands of objects. This is a small sample of the bones from Bankside. Bankside was really a place where a lot of the things that would upset the proper people of the proper city of London, they would go on at Bankside. So you had the slaughterhouses, you had vinegar factories, you had the bear baiting, the binge drinking, the whoring, the theater, all of those Renaissance pastimes that happened on the other side of the river. That is Southwark, and Southwark is, in some way, the Tate's presence in Southwark is punctuating that in some way, that it's really gentrifying that neighborhood that has always been the sort of underclass neighborhood. And that's really what we're finding, of course, in our material that we're collecting. Every single object is, as I said, is cleaned. Then we begin to process things into the, brown glass, green glass, clear glass, purple glass, bottle bottoms, bottle tops, bottles that have writing, refining our categories, refining and refining and refining, really until we run out the clock. Then I construct an enormous double-sided cabinet. Double-sided, of course, because one side is Bankside, one side is Millbank, and this contains 99% of what we find, right? Almost everything is in here. There's a dead dog, there's some shopping carts, a few tires that don't make the cut, but otherwise it's all here, and the cabinet is really full. And these everyday objects take on a kind of majesty. They become curious, and they become absolutely fascinating studies in form. I also don't show you everything because I can't show you all of the clockwork and all of the pens and all of the ID bags and all the human teeth and all of the broken mirrors elements and all the messages and bottles that we find. So I also want to indicate again that this is one way to arrange this collection, but it's not the only way. Now, of course, it's a double-sided cabinet, so the double-sidedness would imply you know, that there's a comparison, right? Isn't that the whole exercise here, to compare the material culture of Bankside and Millbank? But it's not. Again, I can't help but frustrate your desire. That would be the easy thing to do. So I don't present things. I don't present the same kinds of things. I don't present them in a way that would lead to this easy comparison. That's not really my job. So like early collections, like early cabinets, like even the beginning of the museum in the 18th century and early 19th century, this cabinet is also interactive, right? You can pull out drawers and you can peek in and see what's not on exhibit, and the drawers, of course, also, each time you pull a drawer, you find a system of organization, whether that's objects organized from the smallest to the largest, organized around the color spectrum, organized around use and utility, and so every time you find a system of organization, the next drawer shows a different system of organization. You can never kind of find the key to this organization. What instead you end up with is an encyclopedia of systems of organization, right? So, I mean, here you see fasteners, locks, and keys. This is from the greatest hits drawer, for instance, where we have those needles and pins I talked about. In these jars, you have bits of Bellamy ware, you have 16th century ceramics, you have a 400 million year old sea urchin fossil, you have a voodoo doll, bullets from the Second World War, teeth from the bears, from the bear baiting pits, a bit of a medieval lice comb, buckles, children's shoes. And finally, there's a wall that exhibits all of the collaborators on a project like this. So projects, you know, to make a project like the Tate Thamesdig involves really a lot of people. And unlike in cinema, where at the end of the film you have the credits go up and you see that a lot of people were involved beyond just the director, then we don't really have something like that in the art world. So for me, this is an important and somewhat elegant way to try to give credits to not just the people who are so-called volunteers. I don't know why we call them volunteers, because everyone gets paid on these projects, but also people like the Tate publicity staff, the videographer, the project manager, the assistant curator, people who don't always have their faces shown. So that's one of the things I'm pretty interested in, is trying to find some way of acknowledging the hidden labor behind a work like this. I've done a whole series of works on the notion of follies, right? Follies are sort of diminutive structures that have, you know, their real meaning is to make meaning, right? They don't have a practical function like a barn or a tool shed, but rather the follies are sort of pleasure palaces. They're places to create a situation. They are buildings that are discursive, right? And this is a tradition that is very much tied with the aristocracy. You know, these are decorative pleasure pavilions that one would find on enormous estates. Is it possible to wrestle that tradition away from them, you know, and bring it into a public art tradition? I'm always looking for good models for public art, because I don't really understand why, you know, I think public art is one of the most important forms of art. I also think it's the place where the greatest crimes of aesthetics are created. So how can we find another model? And I like the folly. I like the idea also that I can, when I'm working on these, I can work sculpturally, I can work architecturally, and I can create a structure that can function as a vitrine. So I don't have to give up the complexity of materiality that I have as an installation artist. So this is one of the first ones, and this is on the border of the United States and Mexico in the Tijuana Slough Wildlife Reserve. It is a place that is adjacent to the enormous Imperial Beach development. It's right on the border. I mean, the wall is on one edge of this park. It is surrounded by sprawling California suburbs, so the park is continually invaded by you know, young kids on their BMX bikes, with park rangers chasing them to get them out. It is also adjacent to where the Navy trains its helicopter pilots, so at no point can you be here without 1 to 3 helicopters above, sometimes with Navy SEALs dangling from them. So it's not the most restful nature reserve you've ever heard of, but if you are a fish who needs to swim upriver, or a bird who needs to lay its eggs on a beach, this is kind of your best shot in many miles of the border. So wild animals are kind of shoehorned in here. If you're a garbage-eating skunk, possum, or raccoon, this is probably where you sleep in the daytime. So it's a place that has a long history of mischief, right? This was a garbage dump. This is an area that was, is of course on the one of the most contested borders in the world. It is a place that for many years the military used for practice, and it's filled with bomb craters. So I wanted to create a structure that looked like it could be part of that mischief, that had that vernacular mischief, a building that was trying hard to disappear, a building made of camouflage. And it's sited on one of these bomb craters I mentioned. How you would see this work is you would take, you'd give the park ranger your ID, they would give you a key, you'd hike out about 2 miles, which means none of my friends from New York City actually saw this piece, and then you would open it up. And instead of mischief, what you would actually find is a mecca for birders, for people who are interested in birding, and watching birds is a big thing. It's the fastest growing outdoor activity in the United States. So inside of this there are books about birds, there are pictures of birds, there are maps and graphs and all of the kinds of things that birders love. There's optics, there's photography equipment, there's outdoor equipment, and you can come here and spend a fair amount of time, and really as much time as you want, looking at birds, being completely unpoliced because no one goes out there, and experiencing the culture of being a birder in this very odd place. Within it are featured, this is a sort of hall of fame for people who've done a lot for birds, people like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Rachel Carson, Roger Tory Peterson. There's a frieze of images of birds that look like wonderful pictures of birds from the wild, like Elliot Porter kind of photography, but they're actually all dead birds in dioramas, but no one needs to know that. You know, there's a chart in case you want to build a bird. There's some x-rays of birds who have been run into trouble with humans in the park and have been rehabilitated. This is a bird who has some shotgun pellets in him. It's a raptor who was rescued. So, as I said, my friends in New York couldn't have one, wouldn't experience that that piece because of the rigors of the hike. So I built one for them on 23rd Street, and this is called the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit. And the park on 23rd Street, Madison Square Park, probably has the biodiversity of most parking lots, although it does have a few surprising things. So I manned it with a very talented DJ, very lovely person, who was probably the most ignorant person of the natural world I'd ever encountered. And his job is not really to tell you things about the wildlife of Madison Square Park. His job is to show you the resources within this building, which of course you can enter and use, and which has a very decent library on urban wildlife. It has a diorama. It's built much more sort of in the style of the American Museum of Natural History, and it will help you to understand better the natural world that you would encounter. And if that is not enough, we also produced a field guide to the wildlife of Madison Square Park, which has entries for things like pigeons and rats and some of the and grass and dogs that you will see in Madison Square Park, all of which have an absolute fascinating natural history. And pretty much everything within Madison Square Park has a natural history that is intertwined with humans. You know, Madison Square Park is one of the places where the house sparrow was introduced in numbers to the Americas from Europe. So it is an absolutely fascinating place. And these field guides became something I made quite a few of. Another work along this line was done in Essen, in the Ruhrgebiet in Germany, in which I was I came to this place in the bitter cold winter, and and my guide and I were freezing as the water was covered with ice. There were some birds out on the ice, and we found this before hyperthermia could set in. We found this strange cabin with smoke coming out. It was actually like a construction cabin that one would find in a building site, and there was smoke coming out. And my friend said, "I think we can get coffee in here." And we opened the doors at 9 in the morning, and cigarette smoke billows out, and out also billows loud roaring laughter. And we go inside and find picnic tables with large men sort of slapping each other on the back and telling stories. And there's a bar with pinup girl pictures behind the bar. This place had, the walls were caramel colored. I assume that they had once been white, but cigarette smoke over the years had colored them. And I looked at him and said, "What the hell is this place?" And he said, "Oh, this is the Fisherman's Club." I said, "The Fisherman's Club? What do, when does fishing season open?" This is February. He said, "Oh, usually sort of mid-March." So let me get this right. These guys are here smoking and drinking schnapps at 9 in the morning because of their relationship to these animals. This is like a testosterone-driven nature club. And he said, "Yeah." So I said, "Okay, well, now I know what I want to do for our project. I want to produce, a club dedicated to people's amateur interest in animals, but not for machos, but rather for dandies." And so I found this enormous oxygen tank, and I worked with the apprentices at the sewage treatment plant, and they cut me a hobbit door, and we made some alterations to this tank that one could enter in, and we built a turret and observation windows, and we created the Amateur Ornithologist Club, where gentle folk can come and discuss birds and the culture of birds, and one can come and bring their lunch and eat on our bird-themed china, and of course you can access our extensive bird library. There is often, well, there's always an attendant there, and she will introduce to you the fine art of bird watching, bird observation, bird identification. We keep track of all of the birds. As you see, there's a frieze with the names of various people who have contributed to the field of amateur ornithology. Of course, Sibley, Peterson, Buick, Ray. And of course, it is a club, so it is still about smoking and drinking. But you can only drink wild turkey, gray goose, cockspur, famous grouse, Parrot Bay rum, and of course you can only smoke larks. So this is a site that is also dedicated to the material culture of birds and to birds within the decorative arts. And since it's Germany, I have access to extraordinary kitsch, right? I mean, just some of the most beautiful things, and everything in this building is really dedicated to the culture of birds. Very often my project really is about picking up the thread, right? Just trying to come to a place and finding a thread, finding something about this place that maybe is so familiar to locals that they can't even see what it is that makes the place so special, so interesting. And in some way, I am very often a sort of outside troubleshooter who comes into a situation to see something that maybe people are too close to. So one of those places is this town, Folkestone, which is a town in England. It's a seaside town. It was once enormously successful as a vacation town in the Edwardian period and the early 20th century. This is a place where people like H.G. Wells and Bernard Shaw had homes here. The prince would bring his mistresses here. There are grand hotels, and British people don't often vacation in Britain anymore. There's cheap airfares. They've discovered Ibiza. So communities like this have fallen on hard times, and that's compounded by the disasters of really the poor management of the fisheries and overfishing. So places like Folkestone have become very poor. One of the local industrialists was really interested in trying to put Folkestone back on the map and created a triennial, a sculpture triennial, of which I was invited to do the first. And so I also come from a faded seaside city, so I recognize a lot of these sort of problems. But what struck me when I came to Folkestone was that there was a vehement hatred of seagulls. I mean, I grew up around seagulls. I quite like seagulls. And I couldn't really understand why people were why people hated gulls so dramatically. And it was kind of like the conversation wherever you would go. People would start talking about how bad the gulls were. And of course, the gulls are bad because some people love the gulls too much, right? And those people feed the gulls. Gulls are highly intelligent. They soon begin to associate people with food, and they learn that on Fridays people come out of the fish and chip shop with their fish and chips wrapped in paper, and if you zoom by at 40 miles an hour, you can knock that out of their hands onto the ground, and all the gulls come and they eat the French fries, and it seems like they're laughing at you, but they're not. There's a gull in Folkestone who understands how the Tesco department store, the Tesco food store door works, the electronic door. So she walks in whenever she wants. She grabs a bag of chips, brings them outside, and opens them, and again they feast. We've left the gulls very little room and very few resources to survive, and so they are adapting to the anthropocentric world that we're providing for them. I mean, I think they should be applauded for that, but people hate them. And, the gulls have a problem, and it's really a PR problem. And so what gulls need is a mobile gull appreciation unit. So my mobile gull appreciation unit, it travels around the city of Folkestone, and my highly trained gull enthusiasts try to convince people, sorry. Hey, God. My highly trained gull enthusiasts, that's my warning, which says I have a few minutes to go. My evangelical gull enthusiasts travel around the city of Folkestone, convincing people that gulls are actually fantastic, and that we should, that while it is not possible to speak gull, it is very possible to understand a lot of what gulls are saying. Gulls have been studied, especially herring gulls have been studied by ethologists for a very long time. And we know a lot about their vocalizations. We know a lot about their body language. We know a lot about their behavior. And I'm absolutely convinced that to know gulls is to love them. And so we try to give people a crash course on understanding gulls. And through this exercise, we found out that the gull haters, well, they're like haters in general. They're actually less of them than we think. They're just a very noisy minority. They're sort of like the Tea Party. There's not that many of them, but they are damn loud. And we actually found that a lot of people were very positive about gulls. People, began to collect stories of people who had raised gulls, people who had saved gulls, people who had intimate relationships with gulls as pets and as orphans gulls, and so it turned out that this was an extraordinarily it was an extraordinary exercise in really imagining that the population was one thing and finding out through the artwork itself that the population is actually quite different. And we also, of course, produced a book which would help people to understand gull language and to talk a little bit about the distribution of gulls there. This is only halfway through my lecture, right? There's a lot more I can talk about. There's a lot more I look forward to talking to you about. I just didn't get to that many things. But anyway, I'm looking forward to speaking to you all in the colloquium, and thanks.